Welcome to Heresy, the Horus Heresy talk show. In this video, we're going to be talking about missions in Horus Heresy, the Age of Darkness, and how you can build your army to play those missions successfully. We're going to go over a brief overview of the missions in the rulebook. We're going to talk about what your army needs to be able to compete in any of those missions that you might find yourself playing. We're going to answer the question of how many line units do I need in my army, and I'm also going to give my thoughts and advice on the Horus Heresy 2.0 rulebook missions. But before we do that, if you enjoy the content, please do leave me a like and a subscribe. And if you've got any comments or feedback on the episode at all, please leave them in the comments down below. And now, on with the show. First of all, let's take a brief look at the missions themselves and what the conditions are for victory and what you need in those missions. So first, we've got Blood Feud. This is a kill each other mission, pretty much. Nothing special about it. Generally rewards mixed lists, so you're going to pick one type of unit of the enemies to kill, and you're going to get points for every one of that type of unit that you kill. And so if your army is all vehicles or all infantry, you're going to give away more points than if your army was mixed. Particularly good army compositions for this mission are, a few large units of tough infantry and some other mixed stuff so that your infantry aren't giving away as many points. Particularly bad army compositions would be anything with maybe lots of units of 10-men tacticals, easy to kill, or lots of rhinos or lots of drop pods could potentially give away a lot of points very easily. And there's no objectives in the mission. Scoring and denial units are completely irrelevant. Next mission is Onslaught. So this is a kind of weird one. It's got two kind of distinct ways of winning it. So you get a lot of points for killing units on turn 1. And if nobody takes the objective, which is in the opponent's deployment zone and worth a big 5 points, it's likely that whoever gets a significant number of kills in on turn 1 might be the winner just from that turn 1 onwards. And that can obviously be bad for melee or short-ranged armies or reserves-based armies. I've certainly played this mission with my quite short-ranged Iron Hands and found that I could only score 1 point on turn 1. The objective does score very highly, so it's 5 points. And that, on the flip side, is probably going to decide the game if it gets taken, where it does only score at the end. So as well as having to get to your opponent's deployment zone, you've got to be alive on the last turn as well. So it's very hard to take that objective. And you can and often will ignore that objective altogether. Shatter Strike is the next mission. So this is an area controlled by having scoring or denial units in the enemy deployment zone. So you score 2 points for every scoring unit, 1 point for every denial unit at the end of the game. Now, this is a potentially very low-scoring mission because, a lot of the time, particularly if you're playing armies that aren't fast or drop pod armies, that kind of thing, you might only get 1 or 2 units into the enemy's deployment zone and still be alive by the end of the game. So this could really come down to secondaries being super important tiebreakers a lot of the time. And again, there's no objective markers in this mission. Then there's Dominion. So this is more of a classic objective control mission. So there's lots of objectives on the board. There are scoring periods every turn, so it's a progressive scoring mission. That's what we generally call these. It favours multiple scoring units and denial units as well. The secondaries do score randomly, but they do score potentially highly as well because they're D3s. Killing power is important in this mission, but objectives are going to be the main factor for VPs. That's where you're going to score most of your VPs, or at least where you may want to stop your opponent scoring the VPs. Heavy use of denial units in this mission could, in theory, reduce the need for scoring units. As long as your denial units are on lots of objectives, you might not be scoring points, but neither will your opponent, and you could just play for the odd mission objective that you do score, or just the secondaries as well. Tide of Carnage is another area control mission, so this is both deployment zones and the no man's land in between, and you score by having a scoring unit in that zone and the enemy having none, so it's very binary whether you score or not. And vehicles also count as scoring units in this mission, which is a bit interesting. It's also got no objective markers, and denial units are also irrelevant because we're only counting the scoring units. So a lot of the time, the scoring in this could be tied quite a lot. It could be quite low scoring because, or at least low differential because you and your opponent are both scoring your deployment zone a lot of the time, and nobody's scoring the no man's land until later on the game. So a lot of the time, it could be quite close, and the secondaries will be the thing that is more important. Finally, there's War of Lies. There's always one of these, for some reason, in every set of missions in every game that you play, where you're rolling random objective points. And I really dislike these because, you can control 3 objectives to your opponent's 1 and score 0 points, and they score 3 and win the game, even though you've objectively played the mission better. Not a big fan of that personally. But tactically, it's still a classic objective control mission where you score at the end of the game, which is also makes things difficult sometimes because really you can mostly ignore the objectives for most of the game, which doesn't always result in a great game either. You just kill people a lot, and at the end you maybe jump on some objectives, particularly if you're the last player. Arguably only needs denial units, therefore, because the mission scoring is random anyway, so it's questionable benefit whether it's worth taking an objective. All you want to do is make sure your opponent doesn't score too much off them. There's a lot of points for killing stuff in this mission. It uses a death toll secondary, so you're getting points for everything that you kill, which means that a very effective strategy and a less random strategy in this game would just be to kill as much stuff as you can and make sure your opponent doesn't score off objectives with denial units where possible. So with a quick overview of the missions, let's talk about how you build your army for those missions. We'll look for the commonalities in the type of units that you need for those and see what we can do with it. So first of all, secondaries. The secondaries vary from tie-breaking low-scoring missions to actually giving you reasonably chunky points in some missions. So it's important to try not to use sacrificial warlords. Keeping them safe is just like scoring points in some missions. And by sacrificial warlords, I mean skimping on points on your warlord. Maybe he's not very good in combat. You haven't equipped him very well, but you still send him into a fight and he's often going to die or be just easy to kill. I don't think that's generally a good idea. I think investing some points in your warlord, protecting him with extra gear like Terminator armor for the extra wound, a Cyber Familiar, Mantle of the Elder Drake, Sonic Shriekers, the Ultramar Mantle, anything like that is generally worth the points because it can save you from giving away some VP. Lords of War giving away VP in most missions does make them much less desirable. Like, Lords of War are pretty okay at best for their points anyway, and also giving away VP if they die just makes them not that great from a point of view winning the game. Luckily, most of the reason we take Lords of War is because they look cool, so this may not be a problem, but it is a little bit unfortunate that it makes them, not so good. The number of units in your army does matter, and in some secondary scoring, having more units left on the table at the end will score you the secondary. But in some of them, killing the most units will score you the secondary, or you will give away a point for every unit that you do lose. So the number of units can influence, depending on the mission, how many points you score, and more smaller, easy to kill units can be good or bad. But generally, more easier to kill units is bad more often than it's good. One thing to note here as well is that things like Karash or the bonus VP from Sigismund or Headhunter Leviathan range from really good in some missions where the scoring might be low or very even a lot of the time. Those things can be really, really good in giving you another source of VP. That can just mean that you win the game because of that source of VP. 2 from Headhunter Leviathan is huge, and Alpha Legion are very good at completing it as well. In some missions, these things can be completely broken, so Karash is a really good example. If you were to build your army in such a way as you had a lot of Karash units in your army, and you were to play War of Lies, for example, you could completely break the scenario, basically, so you win before you even put your army on the table, because your opponent basically can't score any points. Now, that does depend on how you read the Karash rule. It's kind of written a bit weirdly for the way it interacts with missions. It's probably not worth reading too much into that until we get an FAQ, but what I would say is, if you're going to play events with friends, you obviously don't want to put your army on the table and know that you've already won just because of certain units you've taken. So Magyar Mazan or spamming Eben Keshig, that kind of stuff, is probably not a great thing to do if you want your opponent to have fun as well. Okay, so scoring units. How do those 6 missions tie up into scoring units? Well, scoring's only really critical in 2 missions, scoring units, Dominion and Tide of Carnage. It's advantageous in 3 other missions, Onslaught, Shatterstrike, and War of Lies, but you can absolutely play those missions with only denial units. You do not need scoring units to win those missions at all, and scoring units are completely irrelevant in Blood Feud. So, effectively, 3 of the missions can be won with minimal or no scoring units at all, and one of them it's irrelevant. So you only really need scoring units in 2 missions, which is, not a great start when we're assessing these things. But let's look at denial units. So denial units are either critical, and not critical as in you must have them, but critical as an alternate to scoring units, or because generally you won't put enough scoring units on the battlefield and have an effective army. Denial units are critical or advantageous in 4 of the missions, and they're irrelevant in 2 of them, Blood Feud and Anti the Carnage. So denial units, in a lot of ways, are actually more relevant to your army build than scoring units are. And then if we look at the importance of being able to kill things, so just generally the importance of being good at blowing up your opponent in a game of Warhammer, it's critical in 2 missions. It's critical in Blood Feud, and it's critical in War of Lies as well. It's also critical in Onslaught if you're not going to go for the objective, which I think is often a better way to play that mission. And killing is at least advantageous to the mission result in all of the other 4 missions as well. Killing's always good for playing the mission because you take your opponent's things off the board, they can't score, very obvious. Secondaries as well, though, being good at killing does influence the way your secondaries work. If you kill more units, you're going to score more secondaries. If your unit's more capable of, your army rather, is more capable of killing a warlord, then you're more likely to be able to score those points. Obviously, killing is just generally important for winning games in general in Warhammer. That's not complicated to understand, but when you think about building armies sometimes that are sacrificing some firepower in return for being tougher or harder to kill, it is relevant when you think about it like that. Being tough on its own doesn't win you games, where killing always does. So putting all that together, in 4 of the 6 missions, scoring units are either not needed at all or can be completely bypassed by ensuring you've got enough denial units and making sure you kill your opponent. In 2 of the missions, scoring units are critical, but you can minimize the amount of scoring units that you need by just having a good number of denial units, and particularly if you're well equipped to kill your opponent's scoring units and bring them into balance, or not let your opposing scoring units score at all, you can basically, not really need to bring your own in a lot of ways. So in summary, everything we've talked about, what does that get us to? Well, when answering the question of how many line units should I take, which is a thing that I see come up very commonly, the answer with these 6 missions is make your army good at killing stuff and then worry about how many line units you can fit in, which is not really the way that good sort of games are played in Warhammer. Unfortunately, things that are just about killing each other tend to give you less good games than things where you got to play objectives. So take as many line units as you're either forced to, or you can get into your army for free, because those units are going to contribute to your list plan anyway. So take your compulsory line unit if you've got to, your tactical squads, maybe make them a bit bigger, or just take the line units granted to you by your right of war, so something like Pride of the Legion. And if you're going to take units like Command Squads or Invictus Suzerain or Lernian Terminators, which are all, range from very good to decent units that are probably functional pieces of your army anyway, you sort of get the line for kind of free, because those units are not just there to be line units. Minimize the number of line units, basically. Don't take units just to have more line, is the lesson. Killing the enemy is way more important in these 6 missions than having line. So to conclude that, I would say the conventional wisdom that I've seen passed around quite a lot of 1 line unit per 500 points is likely to be way too many. I think the only armies that can really do that are probably Imperial Fists with a Castellan, while still having an effective army, and Ultramarines using Invictus Suzerain or Praetorian Breaches, which for some reason unknown to me have got line as well as being absolutely amazing. So most armies, if you try to take that much line, you'll just make your army very ineffective against someone who's not built with so much line in mind. So then finally, my thoughts on the missions. I think the book missions are objectively very poor, except Dominion. They heavily disincentivize taking scoring units. A unit being line doesn't make up for the fact that it's just worse at the fighting part of the game, because the fighting part of the game is so much more important. And also on top of that, a lot of the units that are line get Heart of the Legion, which is a really cool and thematic and interesting rule for tactical units to have. But so many of the missions either don't have objective markers in them, or the objective markers are on the other side of the table if you're trying to push out and take one. So it also makes that part of taking things like tactical squads less good, because a lot of the time it just doesn't do anything. The missions heavily incentivize you killing stuff. The VP rewards and the VP awards are all there around your ability to kill things. Also, scoring's done at the end of game in too many of the missions as well, which means that being able to take objectives early with things like tactical squads is completely irrelevant, because you're going to spend most of the game shooting at each other and then just scoring with whatever's left. Rights of war and units that affect VP awards, such as some of the ones we mentioned before, are far too likely to result in unwinnable games for one side or the other in a lot of the scenarios as well. And that's not really the right of war's fault. That's because of the way that the missions are written, incentivizes killing so much or create so many sort of drawn or even point games that these things have too much effect on who wins the game. I'd highly encourage you to write your own missions or to play something different from what was in the book, or just play Dominion all the time. You can still have plenty of great games just playing the same thing. Balance in a lot of games, particularly Warhammer games, the main thing that, affects whether you can have balanced game or not is whether the missions are good. And we've seen lots of times over the years where great missions can compensate for Games Workshop's, iffy grasp of balanced rules writing, but bad scenarios and bad missions will always show up the weaknesses in the game itself. So playing good missions, making sure you play good missions, can really help rein in some of the sillier army builds, and ultimately generally leads to a more fun game. If what you're trying to do is push out your deployment zone, grab an objective, fight over stuff, and you're fighting over that stuff all game, it's better than just being a gun line that after 6 turns moves one unit onto an objective and wins. It's just so much more fun and interesting and engaging for both players from turn 1. We could probably do with a community event pack or something like that. It'd be great to have a set of missions that are commonly used, that people are used to, that just are better than the ones in the book. And that's a thing that's happened a lot over history with Warhammer games as well. A lot of the time throughout Warhammer 40,000's history, people have just ignored the book missions or come up with their own because they just weren't very good. And I think that would be a great thing for Horus Heresy 2 right now. The advantage here as well, most event organisers do this anyway. If you go into narrative events, which make up a large percentage of Horus Heresy events or even semi-narrative events, a lot of the scenarios will be custom. And if you're going to be writing custom scenarios, incentivize people to take line units, make people want to score, disincentivize those sit around and shoot the enemy and don't move a lot or just charge everything into the enemy's face. Disincentivize those armies, make people play the objectives. With all that said, that's the end of the show. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you did, please leave me a like and a subscribe. And if you've got any comments or feedback at all, please leave them down in the YouTube comments below. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.